I'm Sylvia from Vintage Kitchen Vixen, where I share tips for simple living, creating memorable gatherings, and preparing wholesome and traditional recipes with a vintage twist. And today I'm going to be going over some of the garden lessons that I learned last year in my first year of gardening. Now, having a garden is something that I have wanted for years and years and years. There's something really powerful about growing your own food, and I just love that smell of earth and the feel of earth on my fingers and on my hands, although I wear gloves, but I just love that smell and knowing that you're making something grow and having something to nurture all summer long, and then the harvest that comes from it. I absolutely love it, and it's something I dreamed about for the longest time. So for years, whenever I lived in an apartment that had a balcony, I always had plants growing in containers, and then throughout the year I always had like a pot of herbs growing indoors, usually rosemary, because that's the only thing I was able to keep alive because basil hates me. I don't know what I do wrong with basil. If you're really good at growing basil, please give me tips. I don't know what to do. I grew basil last year and I'm like, okay, finally, like they're in ground. I'm going to have a great basil harvest. I'm going to make so much pesto. And then it died on me. I had like 3 basil plants and none of them did well. I had them by my tomatoes, and then somebody's like, yeah, just leave the basil alone. And I'm like, okay, I guess I overwatered, or I just paid too much attention to my basil. I don't know. So I learned nothing from basil last year other than basil hates me. I'm just super inspired when it comes to gardens, and I actually put out a video not too long ago about victory gardens and why I think they should make a comeback and why everybody should have a modern day victory garden. So I have a link to that video in the description below if you want to take a look at that. But today I'm going to be going over what I learned this year, and if there's any wisdom that you want to impart on me, please leave a comment below. I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you're growing in your garden, and if you have any resources, please share them with me because I need all the help I can get. This year I've been ahead of the curve. I started reading this book on biodynamic gardening. So this is an organic way of gardening. It's about feeding the earth, giving back to the earth what it gives you, and also there are things about following moon cycles, which feels a little bit witchy to me, but I mean the moon also plays an important role in the tides, and animals, and I mean like dogs usually go crazy around the full moon. So I think there's something to the moon, but I think there are other areas I need to focus on first, like the health of my soil. So that brings me to the first thing that I learned last year. I need to feed my soil at the start of the season. When I moved into my house, I inherited this large garden patch. There had been tomatoes that were growing the previous year, which I saw when I first looked at the house. By the time I moved in, there was snow on the ground, and come spring, I just started planting in it. Didn't touch the soil, and that was a big no-no because the first thing I should have done was feed the soil, giving it compost or manure just to enrich the soil and just to give it that much needed boost after that long winter and the work that it did the previous summer. So in the fall, that's something that I did do. I did feed my soil, and I'm planning on doing it again when all the snow goes away because there's so much snow outside, I don't even know what to do with it anymore. And since I'm in Canada, I know I'm going to be experiencing a good old-fashioned Canadian spring, which means winter until the end of April. Another important lesson that I learned is when you are watering your plants to not water on the leaves, to water the soil. And you can even use water bottles, and you can make little reservoirs that you can stick into the ground so that water is being fed into the soil when the plants need them. So last year I just sprayed and I prayed, and it did not work out because my zucchini, for one, I started noticing like a white grayish mold on it. And at first, like I told my mom, and she's like, what time of day do you water? And I'm like, I water in the evenings. And she's like, no, like you need to water in the mornings. And I think there's a lot of mixed opinions when it comes to the right time to water. The wrong time to water, and I know this for a fact, is in the afternoon when the sun is at its peak, because the sun and the water, like the water and the sun magnifying on the water, it can burn the leaves. And then also it's good for plants to go without water a bit. Like it's good for plants to be a bit thirsty, because when plants are a little bit thirsty, their roots dig deeper, and when they dig deeper for water, they're also accessing more nutrients that they wouldn't get otherwise. So making them a little bit thirsty actually makes them more resilient, which is something I learned. It is good to be regular with it so that they know when to expect that water. If you think that's completely bogus, like, let me know. This is just what I have learned since last year that I'm going to be putting into practice this year. But yeah, my mom said water first thing early in the morning before the sun comes out, and I'm like, I'm not waking up at 6 in the morning to water my garden. At the time I was working and I just did not have time in the morning to go out and water the garden, so I always did it in the evening. So I'm really curious to know, when do you water your garden? Do you water in the morning or do you water in the evening? Do you think it's absolutely wrong to water in the evening? Let me know in the comments below. Another thing that I learned last year is to harvest all the herbs, except for the basil, which just dies on me. But I have this little area in my backyard that's reserved just for herbs, and last year I planted chives, I planted parsley. There's actually parsley that was there already that came back, which surprised me because I think, as far as I know, parsley is a biennial, or at least an annual, so it doesn't come back every year. So I was surprised by all the parsley I had last year. I had so much parsley. I also planted summer savory, I planted mint, and dill. Now the dill didn't do too hot, neither did the chives. I actually had to go out and buy chives that were already in pots, and the dill is something I should have started indoors because they just didn't really take off very well, and I didn't have the full dill plants that I was expecting to have. But I also planted thyme and oregano, and I think that's all I planted for thyme. But anyhow, I recently learned from my friend Jersey at Farmhouse Basic Collection, and I'll link her below because she has a great channel. Jersey is somebody that you want to check out. She is a fount of knowledge. Like, I learned so much from this woman, and like, she does everything the old-fashioned way. She's a delight to watch and to follow, and definitely check out her channel and tell her I say hi. Jersey recently put out a blog post about herbs and how to preserve them. And I was reading that, and she was saying that when the herbs start to flower, that's when you want to start harvesting them. And that it's important when you're harvesting them not to harvest more than 1/3 of the plant, otherwise they go into shock. Now that rule I followed, about not going too crazy on the plant and just taking a little bit at a time. But when the plants flowered, I didn't know what to do. So for the parsley, whenever I saw a flower, I just cut off the flower, which is probably the wrong way to go about it. I would panic, and my savory started flowering, and I just kept putting it off because, mind you, at the time I was also working. I was balancing with being a mother and doing all the house things, all the cooking and cleaning, and it was super overwhelming. And my garden, I didn't have as much time to work in the garden as I wanted. I tried to go out and visit the garden every day. I watered it every evening, but I didn't have as much time to put into harvesting and preserving because it was just too much, and my priorities were nuts. I harvested my savory once, and then it started flowering, and before I knew it, it just died. Like, my savory was done. I'm like, what happened? So I should have just started harvesting when I spotted those first flowers, and instead I lost my opportunity. And it was the same thing with my thyme. My thyme started flowering, and my oregano was spreading. My mint started flowering, and I harvested some mint. I dried my herbs. At least that thing I did right. I dried my herbs, but I only had like maybe a 3/4 jar full of mint, and I had way more mint than what I yielded, and I just didn't take full advantage of that peak harvest time for picking herbs. I should have ended up with way more mint than this because my mint went crazy. I actually used it in a recipe once. I was making a mint julep and it was so good just to go out in the garden and have fresh mint for that. So if you want to learn how to make a mint julep, I do have a video on bourbon drinks. So I make a mint julep, an old fashioned, and then a sparkling bourbon lemonade. So if you want to learn how to make some bourbon cocktails, do check out that video. It's linked below. So yes, harvest all the herbs when they flower. And there's probably more that I learned from Jersey in that post, but it's just slipping my memory right now. But I'll also link that blog post below if you want to learn more about preserving herbs. So there were a couple of times last summer where I put out a cry for help. For one, like I planted kale. My kale did really well last year, but I had heard something about cabbage moths and to keep an eye out for them. So I think I had something in my stories about the kale and like, what do I do if there are cabbage moths? And my aunt came to the rescue, and my aunt, she's super knowledgeable. I'll actually link her below. She does a lot of vintage English paper piecing. I think that's what it's called. She's very crafty, and she's making the coolest projects, and she actually sells like her little paper piecing kits. So if that's something that you're interested in, like I can barely sew, and it's something I'm supposed to learn, and I haven't really been learning it. She got back to me, and she gave me all kinds of cool tips. So one thing she told me is to save my coffee grounds and also my eggshells, which is a very vintage thing to do. It's what they did during the wartime to nourish their gardens. Like nothing went to waste during the Second World War. Like when there was heavy rationing, like if it could be used, if it could be given another life, it was given another life. Like we're such a wasteful generation compared to the austerity of 60 years ago. Like it's insane, like the difference and how much we waste. But like eggshells and coffee grounds, they went into my garden last year, so at least I was nourishing the soil that way. But at the same time, I don't think it helped my tomatoes, because some of my tomatoes, and this is something that my next door neighbor pointed out, was that every year his tomatoes have like these little rotten bottoms, and he's like, do you have that with yours? And then I was like, no. And then of course, it happened to me. So this is actually a condition called blossom end rot, and it's not a disease, which is what I originally thought, but I learned it is a calcium imbalance. So I don't know if me adding eggshells to my garden made the soil go off balance. I do want to test my soil this year to see what the pH balance is. Apparently you can also have like a little natural, there's a natural way of going about this, and it's just by looking at what grows on your yard. So I think if you have dandelions that are growing, your soil's alkaline or acid, or I don't remember, it's in my little biodynamic gardening book, so I'll just have a slide. Okay, so that's what it was. Sorry, there's so many things going around in my head. I try to organize them, and sometimes things just slip out like a little colander. But this blossom end rot, it's not just inherent to tomatoes, it can also happen to cucumbers, to squash, and to pepper. So it only happened with my tomatoes, and it happened to my neighbors' tomatoes and other people's in the neighborhood. So next year I can be like, hey y'all, it's a calcium imbalance that the plant has, and this is how you fix it. I still don't know how to fix it, but I'm going to figure that out. I still have things I need to figure out. I have time, but I'm just going over the lessons that I learned. So that's one thing that I learned. But before I went off on that tangent, I was feeding my garden grounds and the crushed eggshells. So I save all of my eggshells. And again, Jersey from Farmhouse Basic Collection, she has a blog post that's all about how to use your eggshells, and she like grounds them up and she puts them in smoothies. Like she does all kinds of crazy things with eggshells. Like it's mind-boggling. And she also uses them in the garden. I was really worried about having a problem with squirrels in my garden, because there are squirrels all over my backyard, and I swear that having the eggshells in my garden kept the squirrels out because it would prick their little paws. I don't know if that's true. That's just my running theory. Maybe I was just lucky. Maybe I was growing something that the squirrels didn't like. Actually, there is a plant that you can grow. It's called Ruda, R-U-D-A. I spotted it at the Jean Talon market once in Montreal, and I got a plant for my mother-in-law because she hates squirrels. So apparently it's an anti-squirrel plant. I don't know if it actually works, but you can plant it, and it's apparently supposed to ward off squirrels. But instead I used eggshells, and eggshells are also a slug repellent, so I didn't have any slug problems. So I think the eggshells did something. At the very least, they did something to off-balance my calcium. Another thing that I learned from my aunt, and this is after I posted a picture of the leeks that I planted. I bought a little pot of leeks and I planted them, and I was so proud. And then my mom came over and I was proudly showing her my little garden. And then my mom's like, "That's not how you plant leeks." And I'm like, "Excuse me?" So I posted my error on my Instagram stories, and then my aunt's just like, "Yeah, actually, if you..." Okay, so before I get into that story, so what I did, I just planted that whole clump of leeks and put them in the ground. And my mom's like, "You're supposed to separate all the leeks and plant them in the ground." I'm like, "That's so much work." But then I did it, and my leeks never did great after that. But my aunt was saying that if you keep some of your leeks in the ground after you harvest them, and my leeks didn't do well enough, so I didn't harvest any leeks. So I need to learn what I did wrong so I can fix that. So, you know, I have so many garden lessons to learn still. It's a learning process, and I'm just going to get better and better every year. Having a garden is my best teacher, and also just me wanting to learn about how to become better at it. But anyhow, my aunt says if you leave some if you leave some leeks in the ground after the harvest in early spring, they're going to flower and seed, and then when they seed, like, that way you never have to buy leeks again. So that's something I learned from her. I don't know if it's actually going to happen in my case because my leeks just did so poorly, and also they're under a bunch of snow, so I can't see what's happening at all. Also, I don't know if my rhubarb is going to survive. I spent $18 on a rhubarb plant last year, and I don't know if it's going to survive the winter, because towards the end of the fall, it was so choked up in weeds because it was in this corner of my garden that was completely neglected. It's like in between my shed and the retaining wall, and we'll see how it goes because I love rhubarb. And if it does not go well, I'm just going to get my mom to give me some of her rhubarb harvest, because rhubarb is just so good in recipes. I love rhubarb pie and squares and baking with it. I love rhubarb. Do you love rhubarb? Okay. Anyhow, we'll see how the rhubarb goes. I'll keep you posted on Instagram if you follow me there. And we'll also see how the leeks are doing come early spring, and whether or not the leeks that were left that didn't do well to begin with, whether or not they flower. I suspect they won't, because I don't think I took care of them properly, so I probably just need to buy more leeks next year. One of the most important lessons I learned was know your zone. I'm in like central to eastern Canada. I'm in Quebec, and we have really harsh winters over here. I mean, it's nowhere as bad as in the prairies, which see like sub 40 degrees Celsius weather. Winter isn't always kind to us, and we have to plant accordingly. So I really wanted to start a lot of my plants from seed last year, but I had no idea when. And I didn't bother learning because I just didn't realize how important it is to know your zone. So this year I actually went on, oh, I don't have it. This year I actually went online and I just looked up my area, and I got a printout of like when I should start my seeds. I got a list of what seeds to plant and when. So if I want to start tomatoes, I should start them in April, which surprised me. I thought I would be starting them earlier than that, but that's what they're saying. My mom is saying I should start them earlier than that, so we'll see. But I started all these seeds way too early. And then another thing that I did, if you've been with me for a while, you know how I value frugal living, and I do everything as frugally as possible. Not because I'm cheap, it's just because I like being very intentional with my money. So I'd rather save money in certain areas and splurge in other areas. So one of my biggest examples, which I lay out in my video that's all about frugal kitchen tips, which I will link below. But it's, I cut a lot of corners in the kitchen. I like buy grains in bulk, and then I will put that money that I save towards local produce that is sustainably raised. Anyhow, I had seen this post on Pinterest about using eggshell cartons to start your seeds. I'm like, what a great idea. Like, you have like these little individual trays, you can cut them up after, and that did not work. So for one, they got really damp after a while, And when I went to cut them up, they kind of just fell apart. Like I just kind of like threw everything in the garden afterward. I'm like, here, have the soil. And that was the end of that. I also tried starting zucchini seeds in that. And this is something I had no idea. I learned it last year, but zucchini seeds root deeply, and so I just had an egg carton that was covered in zucchini roots because the roots needed to go somewhere, so they're popping up and like creeping into the soil next door in the next little egg pocket. So that was a disaster, and one that I'll not be repeating next year. I'm actually going to go out and spend money on some little seed starting containers that are egg cartons. So no, I have to pick my battles. But yeah, there are a bunch of seeds that I planted that I started out in the trays that just didn't do well. And then there are also seeds that I planted outside that I should have started in trays. Like chives, for instance. And I just put like a couple chives in a tray, and I didn't realize you have to put a whole bunch of chives in a thing to get those big chive plant things that you get. Like you can't just put one seed in, like you need many chive seeds. So my chives did not work out, and neither did my dill. I should have started my dill indoors. And my kale was okay. I have geranium plants that I keep year-round. I currently have 4 planters of geraniums, and one thing that my mom taught me how to do is to clone them, is to cut clones. And then they'll root, and then I plant them in soil, and then when the weather is right, I transplant them. So last year I got really eager on the first nice day, like I cleared my flower beds, and then I brought my plants outside and I planted them, and it was too cold and I didn't harden them, and they got shocked and they almost didn't recover. And towards the end, many of them did bounce back, but it took a long time for my geraniums to look nice. Unfortunately, they are a hardy plant, but that was a lot of abuse when I did that, and I'm going to be much more careful about how I treat them this year, so I'm going to be doing the same thing. I don't have to buy geraniums anymore. Like I bought geraniums a couple times, and now I have them in the planters, and this time I'm going to harden my plants. And it's the same thing with all the seedlings that I start indoor this year, and I will be doing a video to show you what seeds I'm planting and how I'm going about it. It's so important to harden your plants. It's the same thing with tomato plants. So before you put them in the ground, like take them outside every day and let them acclimatize slowly and let them harden. So that's what it means, to bring them outside and to bring them indoors at night. And then eventually you can leave them outdoors, and then eventually when they're not so used to being indoors all the time, they're used to being outdoors, that's when you can plant them into the ground. And speaking of tomatoes, I already shared a couple lessons that I learned, but another thing that my mom told me is that it's important to rotate your tomatoes every year. So every other year you should move your tomatoes somewhere else. There was one year her tomatoes didn't do well at all, and it's because she planted them in the same place the previous year, and it's a lesson that she learned from my Oma, so her mother, about tomatoes. My Oma, she has the biggest green thumb that I know. Every year she has a garden and it thrives and plants love her, and I know there's so much wisdom that I can learn from her, and I just don't talk to her about gardening, and I really should, because she's just so darn good at it. And her lettuce, like she is continually eating fresh salads from her garden, from her lettuce, and my lettuce did dreadful last year. And I didn't know that you are supposed to continually plant lettuce. And lettuce is one of those plants that they do well. Like if you plant them when it's still cooler outside, they do well. And it's something that you can just plant throughout the summer and it'll just keep yielding. So my lettuce did not do well, and I really hope it does better next year. So crop rotation is good, and it's also good to rest your soil every few years. So you can just plant like a green manure on there, whether that's alfalfa, just to feed nutrients back into your soil. So that's something I haven't done yet. Again, my plot is now 2 years old, and I don't know, I'm going to have to figure something out. Like I want to do raised garden beds. I don't have a huge yard. I mean, my yard isn't even big enough for me to have chickens, according to the city. But I'm doing what I can, and when I feel like my garden needs that rest period, I'll give that to my garden because of what it gives to me. One thing that I planted, and I quickly realized that I made a mistake, was when I planted snow peas. And snow peas is something that shot up for me. So did my beans. They both did super well, but I did not realize when I planted my snow peas that they need something to climb up on. And I'm like, Mom, like, I planted snow peas. Are you supposed to stake them? So my mom's just like, yeah, Sylvia, your snow peas either need to be staked or they need a trellis. They need something to climb. So then I went out and I got a trellis for my snow peas, and all was well, but I think they would have been happier with something bigger. Another thing that I didn't do because I was scared to do it, I didn't thin out my plants. I just wanted to keep all my plants. You know, they worked so hard to shoot up. Can't I just keep all of them? So I wasn't ruthless enough to like pluck them out, and I just wanted to keep all of them, and I didn't thin out my plants. And so I think they were fighting with each other for nutrients, and there were probably root battles underground. I don't know what was happening with my garden. My plants probably didn't know what was happening. They're just like, why isn't this woman thinning us out? I think my plants didn't reach their full potential because I didn't thin them out. And then also there was my watering practices, and then my tomatoes not being rotated. Oh, and then back to the zones. Another thing that I did, like, a lot of my Instagram friends, they have gardens, and they're just like, time for the second planting. And I'm like, there's a second planting? And I got really excited. And so I planted squash, I planted cucumbers, and I planted beets at the end of August. And I'm like, I'll have, everything is going to be ready end of September, early October. And I'm in Canada, and it snowed in October, and none of these things bore fruit. They sprouted, they sprouted, they were growing, and then they were just choked out and they died, and it was just a waste. So there are some things that you can plant later on in the season, but you need to know your zone. There are so many things that I learned last year. I think I hit the most important ones that really stuck with me. A couple things that I really want to do next year apart from applying what I learned. I want to start my own compost bin. So right now I'm using a compost bin. It's a city compost bin, so I compost everything. I just throw everything in that bin and then the city takes it. I'd rather keep that compost for myself to feed my garden. So I really want to have a little compost bin next year. And then I also started learning about companion planting in my Biodynamic Gardening book, and I'll link that below just in case you want to check it out. They talk a little bit about companion planting, so that's something I want to experiment with next year. And companion planting is just plants working together to help each other out. So chives and basil planted near tomatoes, for example, will ward off pests. But chives will also impart like a chivy flavor to tomatoes, whereas basil and tomatoes, they go together really well. So sometimes that's something to bear in mind. And then there's the three sisters. There's squash, corn, and beans. Or is it peas? But apparently the corn is the stalk, and then the beans or the peas can climb up it. And then hi! I'm Sylvia. Oh my gosh, Sylvia. Meats that are meats that are
What's that?
Somebody's been after our kale.
Oh no.
How's the picture? Am I okay? Is the skirt okay?